hell is this place? How did I get here?
On this very day, 4 years ago, a very interesting game called SOMA was released for the PC and the PS4. While it would later release on the Xbox One, September 22nd, 2015 is the anniversary of the game itself. It's all about the horror and the puzzles, but there's just one question. Is it a good game? SOMA can best be described as a horror puzzle game of sorts. Apart from one very specific circumstance, you don't get any guns or weapons of any kind in this game. Instead, if you come across the game's abominations, your only option is to run and hide. You can choose to play safe mode that doesn't actually allow them to kill you, but I like to think I'm a somewhat gamer, so I opted for the can kill you option, which I recommend. You want to avoid being hit by the various enemies as much as you possibly can, because doing so causes you to become very hindered unless you can find one of the one-time use only healing stations. Typically though, you'll find some roadblocks such as a door that needs to be opened or some items that need to be fetched and a variety of puzzles to accomplish that task. In order to help you achieve that, your main tool of trade that you find early on is appropriately called the S.O.M.A tool. You basically use it to open doors with or interface with computers. Somewhat through the game, you even run into a friendly AI which ends up in the S.O.M.A tool itself that you can talk to throughout the game. I believe I've made it known that I'm a fan of piecing together a story yourself through audio/text logs, and this game is one of those. Typically, it's audio logs that you can get either through pre-recordings or even touching some of the fallen. As I mentioned before, what I like about this method is that most of the plot isn't beaten over your head. You're free to delve deeper if you want, and it also gives you more of a Sherlock Holmes kind of vibe where you're piecing it together yourself. You could say it's one of those collect-a-thon for the 100%ers kind of things. There are a few moments where you find yourself completely underwater, which is pretty interesting in and of itself. It's here where you find one of the few benevolent robots in this game, a spherical robot called UH-8. It mostly follows you and cuts open doors for you and just generally serves as a nice reminder that you're not completely alone. Overall, the game is very serviceable for what it is. The puzzles aren't always so obvious, and the enemies prevent you from getting too complacent. If you're a fan of Amnesia and wondered what it would be like if you took that and placed it at the bottom of the ocean with a dystopian future full of identity crisis, you should feel right at home here.
Look, we already know it can be done. We don't need to make it a big deal.
It is a big deal, Kath. It's a huge deal.
Perhaps the biggest strength of the game is the plot. While the gameplay is fine, it's the plot that really had me invested to go forward. You play as a man named Simon Jarrett, whom after getting into a serious car crash has brain damage that seems to have gotten progressively worse over time. He's called by David Munchie, who thinks that getting a scan of his brain could help in an experiment he's working on for brain reconstruction. Naturally, Simon agrees to it. After having to find the tracer bottle he's required to drink for the procedure, he's off to have his brain scanned.
It feels like milk, but the taste, it's like sucking on a penny.
However, things don't go according to plan. As soon as his brain is scanned, he seemingly blacks out and ends up in an old rundown facility. Naturally, Simon has no clue what the hell's going on and sets out to find answers. After running across various AI, both harmless and not so harmless, Simon eventually runs into Catherine, a benevolent AI whose robotic body is in a state of disrepair and thus is placed into his S.O.M.A tool. Without spoiling anything, Simon makes some horrific discoveries about the truth of the location, as well as himself. Not only that, but there's an AI known as WOW that in its attempts to preserve humanity did some questionable things that led to the creation of the monsters you face throughout the game. Catherine's alternative plan is called the Ark, essentially a utopia where the spark of humanity can live on in space. Some of the things that happen can get downright disturbing, and the game definitely delves into the idea of an identity crisis. All I have to say is the ending is like a severe punch to the gut. When I played through it, I knew it was going to happen, and I still had a big reaction to it. Let's just say whether it's a good or bad ending depends on your interpretation, and at least in some respects, it doesn't end well. The game does, interestingly enough, give you a few moral choices throughout the game. Some are a matter of life and death, and at least one where you have to kill one of two beings and you have to choose which one it's going to be. In case it wasn't obvious by now, I love SOMA's plot all over, and it's definitely the highlight of the game. I'd highly recommend you play it for yourself, or at least check out someone playing it on YouTube so that you can see the big twists as they unfold. I have a full playlist on Let's Plays if you want to go that route, wink wink. Trust me, it's worth it. The game was made by a small independent game company known as Frictional Games. When you keep that in mind, it's a surprisingly beautiful game. Now, I'm not gonna BS you and say it can compete with AAA games released this year or even when the game came out, but it's a very visually appealing game for what it is. If I had to pick something to compare it to, I'd say the presentation is akin to Doom 3 with an aesthetic somewhat akin to Bioshock 2. You can probably see in this very review footage that it manages to be a very attractive game, at least in my opinion. Perhaps my favorite areas from a visual perspective are when you're roaming around in the ocean floor. The floating particles, fog, and overall atmosphere do a good job making it feel as though you're pushing through actual water. The horrible abomination creatures you'll be facing are also very appropriately disturbing looking, with what look like giant growths and tentacles growing out of them. Regular human models are used sparingly, understandable given they aren't exactly the easiest to make, but they look fine when they're there. Like I said, you probably aren't going to confuse it with a AAA game that released this year, but I think it would be fitting on the PS3 or 360 at the very least. The music is also very atmospheric and can range from beautiful and serene to very unsettling or even quite a bit of melancholy. The voice acting is also quite well done. Simon can come across as very whiny at times, but it's a bit understandable given the situation, and I'm pretty sure that's the point. Granted, he really needs to chill at times, especially to Catherine.
This you.
All in all, the game excels on a presentation standpoint. It, along with the plot, are the big strengths of this game to be sure. By the standards of a small indie company, it does what it does very well, and it manages to be an enjoyably dark experience throughout the whole thing. SOMA is a very interesting game to say the least. It isn't the most action-packed or involved game. If you're looking for something like that, this definitely isn't for you. However, if you like a good plot and figuring things out in a very atmospherically involved game, you'll find plenty to love here. As I mentioned earlier, I recommend not using safe mode unless you're an extremely casual gamer, since the threat of dying gives it more of a challenge and actually makes it feel more tense. It really fits with a struggle to survive, which perfectly complements the story if you ask me. While the gameplay isn't its biggest strength, it's certainly not bad and was more than good enough to keep me going. I'd highly recommend it for what it is, but if this kind of gameplay just isn't for you, the option of watching someone else play is a very valid way to absorb the story. Hint hint. Shameless plugging of my Let's Plays aside, thanks for watching the review and I'll see you next time.